Operation Anaconda, the Frozen Valley. Setting the stage into the Shah-i-Kot Valley. In early 2002, just months after the initial invasion of Afghanistan, the U.S. military faced a sobering reality. The war was far from over. While the Taliban had been driven from Kabul and other key cities, remnants of al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters had regrouped in the rugged, snow-covered mountains of eastern Afghanistan. Among the most hostile of these strongholds was the Shah-i-Kot Valley, a remote and freezing battleground where ancient terrain met modern warfare. Situated in Paktia province near the border with Pakistan, Shah-i-Kot, Pashto for Place of Kings, was a natural fortress. Its steep ridges, deep ravines, and high-altitude conditions made it nearly inaccessible. For centuries, it had resisted invasion. Now, it was believed to harbor hundreds of al-Qaeda fighters, including high-value targets who had fled the caves of Tora Bora. In response, the U.S. military launched Operation Anaconda, the first large-scale conventional battle in the Afghanistan war. It was intended to be a swift, overwhelming strike to crush enemy forces hiding in the valley. The plan called for a classic hammer and anvil maneuver. U.S. and allied Afghan forces would air assault into the valley to engage the enemy directly, while other units blocked escape routes from the surrounding high ground. The operation was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious. Intelligence estimates significantly understated the number and readiness of enemy fighters. Commanders believed they were facing a few hundred scattered insurgents. In truth, the valley housed over 1,000 well-equipped, entrenched al-Qaeda combatants. They were prepared for a fight, and they knew the terrain better than anyone. Task Force Mountain, made up of U.S. Army units from the 10th Mountain Division, 101st Airborne, and Special Operations Forces, was assigned to lead the mission. Alongside them were Afghan militia fighters, loyal to anti-Taliban warlords. But trust between the Afghan and American forces was tenuous at best. Communication was often fractured, and coordination on the ground would prove dangerously inconsistent. The air insertion into the valley began on March 2, 2002, just before dawn. Soldiers descended from helicopters into the bitter cold of the high-altitude valley floor. Almost immediately, they came under intense and unexpected fire from concealed enemy positions. Mortars, RPGs, and machine guns echoed across the mountain walls. The Americans had walked straight into a kill zone. Instead of a quick operation, Anaconda was turning into a brutal standoff. Units were pinned down. The terrain made movement and resupply nearly impossible. Air support, hindered by thin air and narrow valleys, struggled to provide immediate relief. The enemy held the high ground, and that changed everything. What was meant to be a decisive blow was now becoming a desperate fight for survival. And in the frozen valley of Shah-i-Kot, the U.S. military would face one of its greatest tests of endurance, adaptation, and raw courage. The battle begins. Ambush in the mountains. As dawn broke on March 2, 2002, the snow-covered peaks of the Shah-i-Kot Valley lit up with gunfire. U.S. and Afghan troops who had landed just hours earlier found themselves instantly outgunned and outmaneuvered. Enemy fighters, deeply entrenched in fortified positions on the surrounding ridgelines, had been watching, waiting. The Americans had entered a trap. From hidden bunkers carved into the rock, al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters unleashed coordinated ambushes. Mortars rained down from above, while machine gun nests opened fire on exposed landing zones. Some U.S. units were pinned immediately upon landing. The narrow valley, with its limited cover and steep terrain, offered no protection. Helicopters were forced to fly dangerously low through mountain passes under RPG and small arms fire. Several were hit, some nearly brought down. One of the most intense engagements occurred at a landing zone later nicknamed Hell's Halfpipe. A platoon from the 10th Mountain Division dropped into this area, found itself completely surrounded. They dug in under fire, returning shots while calling desperately for air support. The cold was brutal, but the incoming fire was worse. Medics scrambled to treat wounded soldiers as bullets chewed through their positions. Meanwhile, special operations units were engaging in small unit tactics across the upper slopes. Navy SEALs, Green Berets, and Delta Force operatives conducted reconnaissance and targeted strikes, but many of their movements were delayed or altered due to the underestimation of enemy strength. Communication between units was strained, hampered by the mountains and the sheer chaos of simultaneous firefights. In the early hours of the battle, Petty Officer First Class Neil Roberts, a Navy SEAL, fell from a helicopter that had been struck by RPG fire. He landed alone on Thakur Gar, a peak overlooking the battlefield. What followed was a desperate effort to rescue him, a mission that would lead to a separate deadly clash now known as the Battle of Roberts Ridge, in which multiple Special Forces operators lost their lives. This tragic event further highlighted the deadly unpredictability of the operation. As the hours passed, U.S. forces called in everything they had: AC-130 gunships, F-15s, Apache helicopters, and B-52 bombers pummeled enemy positions. High explosives rocked the valley floor and shattered mountaintop bunkers. Still, many al-Qaeda fighters held their ground or melted into cave networks. The Americans were making progress, but slowly and at a steep cost. Back at command posts, frustration mounted. The assumption that air power and rapid mobility would ensure dominance was proving dangerously optimistic. The enemy knew the terrain, was well armed, and was willing to die in place. The operation's logistics, designed for a short mission, were now being stretched thin. Troops faced dehydration, frostbite, and fatigue, all while carrying 70 to 100 pounds of gear through knee-deep snow at 9,000 feet. Despite the ambushes, the setbacks, and the loss of life, American forces held their ground. They adapted quickly, coordinating with Afghan allies where possible and adjusting tactics to regain the initiative. In the face of adversity, the U.S. military showed its resilience. But the fight for the Shah-i-Kot Valley was far from over. Tactical shifts and hard lessons. By the third day of Operation Anaconda, it was clear that initial plans had crumbled under the weight of reality. The U.S. forces were engaged in far more than a swift raid. They were locked in a brutal high-altitude battle against a deeply entrenched, highly motivated enemy. The Shah-i-Kot Valley had become a crucible, forcing American commanders to adapt rapidly or risk disaster. One of the most urgent changes involved air-ground coordination. The operation had suffered from poor integration between ground units and supporting aircraft during the early phases. Communications were often disrupted by the mountainous terrain, and some units had no direct link to close air support. To correct this, forward air controllers were repositioned, and satellite communications were reconfigured to provide more reliable guidance. This allowed B-52s, F-16s, and AC-130s to deliver devastating strikes with increasing accuracy, especially on ridge lines where al-Qaeda fighters had built fortified positions. Ground units also shifted tactics. Initial plans to move through open valley terrain were abandoned in favor of slow, methodical advances along ridgelines and draws. Units from the 101st Airborne and 10th Mountain Division began pushing toward the high ground, clearing cave complexes and using high explosives to destroy fortified bunkers. Movement was grueling. At elevations above 9,000 feet, each step through snow and rock was a test of endurance. Frostbite, altitude sickness, and sheer exhaustion became as dangerous as the enemy. Afghan allies, whose contributions were initially mixed, also became more engaged as the battle progressed. While early in the operation, many Afghan fighters had withdrawn under fire or failed to coordinate effectively, U.S. commanders began embedding American advisors with militia groups to improve trust and communication. In some sectors, Afghan fighters proved instrumental in locating enemy hideouts and navigating the harsh terrain. Meanwhile, The Battle of Roberts Ridge had underscored the need for clearer command structures and better situational awareness. The mission to recover Neil Roberts and assist other stranded SEALs and Air Force personnel resulted in 7 American deaths, many of them due to miscommunications, delays, and exposure to overwhelming enemy fire. These losses haunted the operation, but also drove home hard lessons about joint operations under extreme conditions. The psychological toll on soldiers was mounting. Some had been under near constant fire for 72 hours. Rations were running low. Helicopters bringing supplies and reinforcements were still at risk from RPGs and anti-aircraft weapons. Yet morale, remarkably, held. Many soldiers would later describe the experience as the most difficult and defining of their careers, an ordeal where training, grit, and the brotherhood of arms were all that kept them moving forward. By March 6th, the tide had begun to turn. More airstrikes and aggressive clearing operations had pushed enemy fighters into retreat. Bunkers were destroyed, key positions secured, but the cost had been high and the operation was not yet over. As Task Force Mountain prepared for the final phase of the mission, they did so with a sobering clarity. The battle for the Shah-i-Kot had changed them. Breaking the enemy. Final push through the valley. By the second week of March 2002, the momentum in the Shah-i-Kot Valley had shifted. After days of bloody stalemate, U.S. forces were slowly beginning to dominate the battlefield. Enemy positions, once impregnable on the ridgelines, were now under constant bombardment. The freezing mountainous terrain still posed brutal challenges, but American troops were no longer reacting. They were advancing. The focus now turned to systematically clearing the valley of remaining al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters. Intelligence, drawn from aerial reconnaissance, intercepted radio chatter, and Afghan informants, indicated that enemy forces were falling back into cave networks and narrow defiles on the valley's southern edge. These areas would become the target of the final push. Task Force Hammer and Task Force Rakkasan, composed of elements from the 101st Airborne, Delta Force, and Afghan militia allies, began sweeping operations through contested zones. Their strategy was straightforward, yet dangerous. Press the enemy from multiple angles, seize remaining high ground, and trap survivors in kill zones where airstrikes could be directed with precision. Each advance was met with resistance. Fighters from Chechnya, Uzbekistan, Pakistan, and the Arab world, foreign jihadists hardened by years of conflict, had joined the Taliban and al-Qaeda in a desperate last stand. Some chose to fight to the death. Others used the terrain to escape through smuggler routes toward the Pakistani border. The Americans knew time was short. If they couldn't close the valley soon, the enemy would disappear again into the shadows. In one of the final major engagements, a platoon from the 10th Mountain Division uncovered a complex system of caves fortified with heavy weapons. It took multiple airstrikes and a prolonged firefight to clear the area. The ferocity of resistance shocked many. Clearly, the insurgents had prepared for a long fight and had never expected U.S. forces to persevere this far. Behind the front lines, the logistics machine groaned but held. Helicopters flew countless resupply and medevac missions under fire. Engineers built makeshift landing zones on snowy cliffs. Combat medics, often operating in exposed positions, saved dozens of lives. Every soldier, infantryman, pilot, or support staff was tested in the crucible of Anaconda. By March 17th, most organized resistance had been broken. Intelligence reported that remaining enemy fighters had scattered. The Shah-i-Kot Valley, once a sanctuary for al-Qaeda, was no longer safe. Dozens of bunkers were destroyed, hundreds of weapons recovered, and approximately 500 enemy fighters were estimated to have been killed. Yet the cost was sobering. 8 Americans killed, over 80 wounded, and many Afghan allies lost. The terrain had claimed its share of victims too. Frostbite, hypoxia, and injury from falls were common. Still, The mission had achieved its goal: disrupt and dismantle a major al-Qaeda stronghold. Operation Anaconda had pushed the limits of modern warfare, testing tactics, leadership, and willpower under some of the harshest conditions imaginable. But it was not just a military victory. It was a battle that exposed the complexity of the war ahead. Legacy and lessons: how Anaconda shaped the war. When Operation Anaconda concluded in March 2002, it marked the end of one of the first large-scale conventional battles of the post-9/11 era. But beyond the tactical victories and terrain gained, its true legacy lay in the hard-earned lessons it forced upon the U.S. military, a sobering glimpse into the long, complicated war that was still unfolding. First and foremost, Anaconda shattered the illusion that the early success of the Afghanistan invasion, rapid regime change, minimal resistance, would define the conflict. The battle exposed a resilient enemy, willing to fight to the death, an enemy who understood the terrain intimately and used it with devastating effect. The expectation of a quick cleanup operation gave way to the reality of a protracted insurgency. One of the clearest lessons from the operation was the critical importance of joint force coordination. Operation Anaconda revealed deep friction between the Army, Air Force, and Special Operations units. Poor communication led to delays in air support, confusion over command roles, and missed opportunities. In response, the Pentagon launched serious reforms in joint planning and interoperability, changes that would later shape how the military conducted operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. The battle also highlighted the limits of air power. Despite overwhelming aerial superiority, the early stages of Anaconda saw ground troops dangerously exposed due to miscommunication and terrain constraints. It reminded commanders that no amount of technology could fully replace boots on the ground, or the human decisions made under pressure. Perhaps one of the most enduring stories was that of Roberts Ridge, where acts of valor by Navy SEALs and Air Force combat controllers exemplified the sheer courage demanded in modern warfare. Their bravery, along with that of countless others in the valley, became case studies in tactical training and leadership development across all branches. The Afghan partnership during Anaconda also presented a mixed picture. While some local fighters proved valuable allies, many units lacked discipline or fled under fire. This inconsistency raised concerns about the future of joint operations with Afghan militias and foreshadowed the long, complex path of building local capacity in a fractured country. Strategically, Operation Anaconda served as a wake-up call. It reinforced the idea that counterinsurgency in Afghanistan would be far more complex than originally imagined. The enemy was elusive, terrain mattered immensely, and cultural intelligence was just as vital as firepower. It also ignited a broader conversation about the nature of modern warfare, one that blends guerrilla tactics, asymmetrical threats, and unconventional alliances. Years later, many veterans of the operation would reflect on the battle with pride, pain, and respect. Operation Anaconda didn't end the war, but it revealed what the war would require: adaptability, endurance, and a deep understanding of the human and geographical terrain. Remembering the Frozen Valley Operation Anaconda was more than just a battle. It was a harsh awakening to the true nature of the war in Afghanistan. In the frozen peaks of the Shah-i-Kot Valley, American soldiers faced one of their toughest trials, not only against a determined enemy, but against terrain, weather, and the limits of their own endurance. It was a test of leadership, courage, and unity under fire. The stories of those who fought, of sacrifice, improvisation, and resilience, remain etched in the history of modern warfare. In remembering Anaconda, we honor those who stood firm in the snow and smoke, and we recognize the operation's lasting impact on how wars are fought, led, and survived. Because in the mountains of Afghanistan, war was redefined.